What is up, pilots, instrument pilots, and instructors? Welcome to the IFR Pilot Podcast. This is season 1, episode 2. I'm your host, Toby Rice, master flight instructor and airline transport pilot. Today, we're going to be talking about departure briefings and arrival briefings with a special emphasis on instrument approach briefings. Today on podcast, joined with me is my good friend, Jay Rivenbark. Jay is an airline pilot and instrument flight instructor. And Jay, did I do your double I back in the day?
Yeah, absolutely. So although I got my instrument through a Part 141 university, we did work together to get my instrument instructor certificate.
Yeah, I remember that was the good old days, back when we were flying little airplanes around, just having fun. That's good. Well, Jay, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about yourself, even though I know everything there is to know about you, probably. But we've been friends for years. But if you could go ahead and just give us an idea of what your flying experience is like, and then we can kind of jump into today's topic.
Sure, yeah. So I have right about 3,000 hours in various types of aircraft. However, most recently I've been flying the Embraer 175, the Boeing 757, and Boeing 767. And really had a good time doing it, really enjoying the 121 environment. I am a flight instructor, an instrument instructor, multi-engine instructor, and maybe one day I'll get my rotorcraft commercial and instructor certificates as well.
Good stuff. Yeah. So, when it comes to instrument procedures, we get a lot of this in aviation where students and instructors can't really make up their mind as to what they want to teach, how they want to teach it. I found that especially departure briefings, arrival briefings, and approach briefings are oftentimes overlooked or overcomplicated. Um, What is up, pilots, instrument pilots, and instructors? Welcome to the IFR Pilot Podcast. This is season 1, episode 2. I'm your host, Toby Rice, master flight instructor and airline transport pilot. Today, we're going to be talking about departure briefings and arrival briefings with a special emphasis on instrument approach briefings. Today on podcast, joined with me is my good friend, Jay Rivenbark. Jay is an airline pilot and instrument flight instructor. And Jay, did I do your double I back in the day?
Yeah, absolutely. So although I got my instrument through a Part 141 university, we did work together to get my instrument instructor certificate.
Yeah, I remember that was the good old days, back when we were flying little airplanes around, just Having fun. That's good. Well, Jay, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about yourself, even though I know everything there is to know about you, probably. But we've been friends for years. But if you could go ahead and just give us an idea of what your flying experience is like, and then we can kind of jump into today's topic.
Sure, yeah. So I have right about 3,000 hours in various types of aircraft. However, most recently I've been flying the Embraer 175, the Boeing 757, and Boeing 767. And really had a good time doing it, really enjoying the 121 environment. Um, I am a flight instructor, an instrument instructor, multi-engine instructor, and maybe one day I'll get my rotorcraft uh, commercial and instructor certificates as well.
Good stuff. Yeah. So, when it comes to instrument procedures, we get a lot of this in aviation where students and instructors can't really make up their mind as to what they want to teach, how they want to teach it. I found that especially departure briefings, arrival briefings, and approach briefings are oftentimes overlooked or overcomplicated. Um, we're both ATP rated pilots, and when I did my ATP, I did it part six. Technically, I did it part 142. I did it at type rating school when I got typed on the citation, but um, it was all part 91 operations. So I had to figure out, how am I going to brief the departure to the crew? How am I going to brief the arrivals and the approaches? How can I use CRM in a way that's just practical and makes sense? Even though now I'm flying mostly single pilot. Of course, your experience is a little bit different. Having gone to the airlines, you've experienced the training in that 121 environment. So there's going to be a lot more procedures and policies that are involved in that. And I'm interested to know exactly what that looks like for you, or at least some extent of it. But so the plan today is just to talk about departure briefings, arrival briefings for general aviation, just based on the lessons that you've learned as an airline pilot. And then once you get through those lessons, then we can kind of have some discussion and figure out the special emphasis areas on instrument approaches. That seems to be, in my experience now, instructing instruments seems to be one of the weak areas. So let's just go ahead and jump right into that. So tell me, how do you, as an airline pilot, flying multiple different types of regional and heavy jets, how do you brief as a first officer the um, the what's the word I'm
Arrivals,
looking for?
approaches,
There we
departures.
go. Thank
Yeah,
you. How do you brief that depending on the situations?
yeah. Well, so most everything in the 121 environment is sort of a keep it simple mindset. And one of the big things is staying ahead of the aircraft. So, if you're up in cruise and hey, I've got 75, 50 miles to top of descent, mentally I need to have already thought through beginning the descent, descending usually via standard arrival routing, shooting an approach, and then the options of landing or executing a missed approach or a go around. Um, if you land, got to know where you're going to taxi. Hopefully, you already know where you're going to park, and the whole time you'll be speaking with air traffic control. So you need to know what are the frequencies I anticipate receiving to contact, air traffic control. So um, I'd say the big thing to start with is maintaining positive control of the aircraft. So if I'm going to be heads down in my EFB, then I probably don't need to be manipulating the aircraft at that point. So if I'm going to be pulling up my approach plates and configuring the airplane ahead of time, loading the approach into the FMS, then oftentimes we'll transfer control of the aircraft from one pilot to another. It's nice to have another pilot sit next to you that's appropriately rated in the aircraft, that you can hand off the duty of flying the airplane, which is, as we know, aviate, navigate, communicate. Aviate is the most important duty. So the first thing that we do is we'll hand off the controls to the other pilot, and once we've done that, then we'll go through one of our briefings. And like I said earlier, everything is keep it simple. So uh, there's different techniques that different operators will use. The one I've just kind of stuck to personally that fulfills those requirements is the want brief, WANT, the want brief. And this brief, using the same acronym, you can tailor it to departures, arrivals, instrument approaches. And when you're developing your brief, you are familiarizing yourself with the current state of the aircraft, the desired state of the aircraft, and the arrival, the approach, the go around, the landing, the taxi, and the parking of the aircraft. And so it does take a little bit of time if you have a complex arrival or approach to build this brief. So by the time you present the brief to the crew, then you have developed a solid plan. All the while, the other pilot is maintaining control of the aircraft. If you have a flight instructor, another rated pilot, even a private pilot next to you that can maintain level of flight, that can be a valuable resource to use. Things change when you get into the single pilot world because you don't have someone else that you can hand control of the aircraft to. Regardless, you are still responsible for monitoring the flight path of the aircraft. And in the single pilot world, you might be able to sort of hand over the stick and rudder of the aircraft to the autopilot, but you're still responsible for monitoring the flight path of the aircraft and knowing what it's going to do over the next 5 seconds, 5 minutes. So the want briefing for departure is going to, so the want briefing, the acronym stands for weather, airport, NOTAM, and threats, or specifically threat. Start off with the weather. That's going to be, what's up?
I'm going to write that down real quick. Just give me 1 second to pull this up. Tell the audience again one more time what exactly that briefing is and what the acronym was again.
Yeah, the briefing is a want briefing because everybody wants the brief, and I'm sure you want to listen to my brief.
I would love to listen to your brief, actually. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, and so weather, airport, NOTAM, and threat. So we'll start off, whether you're departing from or arriving to an aerodrome, an airfield, or a Class B airport, you need to know what's going on locally. Now, if you're flying around a Piper Cub, you look out your window. You go, hey, weather looks good. I see the windsock, and I'm going to have whatever type of wind, I'm going to land accordingly. The bigger the aircraft gets, the further from your arrival station that you departed, then it is more likely that you will have different weather than what you planned when you left your departure station. So for the departure, before you even get in the airplane, you can develop by looking at the METAR, by looking at the AWOS or the ATIS and getting the current ATIS code, what the weather is at the airport. So the things that you're looking for, we talked about very briefly earlier, was you could use an acronym of WAC, W-A-C. That's one that you and I just came up with. And, that was what, wind, altimeter, and clouds or ceiling.
Yeah, it was wind, altimeter, and ceilings. What's the wind? What's the altimeter? What's the ceilings? Yeah.
Yeah. Get to a busier airport, you're going to need to know runways in use and approaches in use. But as far as general aviation is concerned, at smaller airfields without an ATIS, then I think it's absolutely pertinent to know the direction and the speed of the wind, the altimeter setting, and the ceiling. With that information, you can select an adequate approach, plan your landing, and prepare for a missed approach or the likelihood of a missed approach based on the ceiling. So the W in want is weather. Next, you have airport. So I need to get from where I am to, so if you're departing, you get from where you are to getting away from the airport. What routing is going to take you from where you are to off the airport? Conversely, if you're doing an arrival, it's I need to get from where I am to the surface of the airport and to my parking gate. Well, what routing is going to get me there? So during the airport section, you could also say, whether arrival, but the arrival doesn't include the approach. You could say the A is approach. Airport seems to encompass it all in my mind. So you'll have for the departure, the AN1 brief airport. So first of all, where am I parked on the airport? Okay, who am I going to talk to first? From that point forward, I'm going to taxi. Okay, what's my expected taxi route? Well, you got to know which runway you're going to. Likely the weather, the ATIS or the AWAS either told you what runway to expect, or you can develop an idea what runway to expect. So where am I at? Where am I going? Who am I talking to on the way? Then mentally, when you've arrived at the runway, you got to think about your takeoff. How long of a runway do you have? What's the condition of the surface of that runway? Well, that will be covered in the weather. From there, after you take off, we have engine out procedures. So you brief both a normal departure and an engine out procedure. And then your departure, which includes speed restrictions and altitude restrictions up to the altitude to which you're cleared by air traffic control and your pre-departure clearance. Next, you look at your NOTAMs. Are there any NOTAMs applicable to taxiways on the ground? Are there NOTAMs applicable to the operation that I'm doing? Do I need 24 hours prior approval to operate at this airport? Are there NOTAMs about runway condition codes, or just the surface is wet? An air traffic controller can add remarks to the NOTAMs, to the ATIS, that would tell you more about the surface conditions, but oftentimes RCCs are in the NOTAMs as well. Lastly, you're going to come up with threats, but you're really focusing on the biggest threat at hand. So throughout my departure, I'm going from the aircraft being parked, starting up, speaking with usually a clearance or a ground controller, taxiing out, departing the aircraft, and getting up to my clearance limit of my altitude. In there, I'm going to find the largest threat, come up with a plan to mitigate that threat, and that'll be part of the briefing as well. Oftentimes, it could be something like, okay, we have a special engine out procedure. So if I'm below 500 feet, we'll do procedure A. If I'm above 500 feet, field elevation, or AFE, then I'll do the normal procedure. Or it can be hotspots that I'm going to taxi through. Maybe there's hotspots 1, 2, and 3, and I'm going to cross through one of them. And in a crew environment, the way that we can mitigate that threat is just to say, okay, when we approach this hotspot, or number one, I'm going to write down my taxi instructions. And number two, when we approach this hotspot, we're both going to stop everything we're doing, be heads up and focused on just taxiing the airplane, make it to the hotspot, and then we can go back to one pilot being heads up while the other one's heads down, working on configuring the aircraft and navigating.
Okay, cool. So basically, make sure I got all that correctly. I have some notes written down here. Basically, so your want brief is the idea of I want to brief my departure, I want to brief my arrival. And that's going to be want, W-A-N-T, weather, airport, NOTAMs, and threats. An example for departure, from what I'm understanding, would be getting your weather. That includes the ATIS, AWAS, METAR, at your current location, where you're at right now, of course. And what's the weather requirements for takeoff alternate? Do you meet your takeoff minimums? Those types of things. Of course, Part 91, we don't have mandatory takeoff minimums, but it's a good idea to use the takeoff minimums that are in the TERPs not the TERPs, but in your airport information. In Part 91, this is a personal minimum. As far as departure alternate, as far as the departure briefing for airport, that's going to include where you parked now, what runway you're going to, what's your taxi route, hotspots, frequencies, like you said. NOTAMs is NOTAMs, right? And then threats for departure, like what's the highest expected level of threat, and what's the strategy that gets you from A to B while mitigating that threat. For departure, that's kind of my takeaways from that. And then for arrival, same thing, kind of in reverse. What's the arrival and alternate to ATIS, AWAS, METAR, TAF. What's the weather going on down there? The airport and one would be the routing. Like what's if we're flying the jet, right? We're typically on an RNAV arrival of some kind.
Mhm.
So is that plugged into the box, right? Is it plugged into my GPS? Like you fly with, a flight management computer. I typically fly with a GPS system like a Garmin GTN 750, a G1000, G3000, that type of setup. Same logic is still the same. What's your descend via altitudes? What's your approach? And I really want to hit on approach here a little bit and ask you some questions about that. We'll probably brief some approaches into Nashville. What's the approach type, runway, links, routes, parking location, like you said? And parking location is interesting to me that you mentioned that because, we typically don't think about that very much in Part 91 flying because we're flying small airplanes that can park anywhere. But, if you're flying a larger jet, then you need to know, where am I putting this airplane? Especially
Well,
in the airline world, where are you going to a gate, right?
yeah, consider this. I mean, you could fly in a 172 with your headset on, and you land and you're rolling out of the runway. And what's the tower controller going to ask you before they tell you, if you're landing on a center runway or on a busy airport, could even be a Class C airport, they're going to say, where are you parking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so I need to
exactly.
know, am I turning left? Am I turning right? And I mean, it is not unheard of for, let's say that you are going to a service pump that's over to the left, and tower is expecting you to go to maybe signature FBO, which is to your right as you're landing. So they'll say, okay, exit the runway via Foxtrot. Although that is a direction, it's your job as the pilot to be familiar with the airport and to know, hey, I'm not going to signature, I'm going to the self-service fuel pump, and you'll just say, uh, understand exit via Foxtrot. We're going to go to self-service. Can we exit via, Charlie? And they'll say, hey, yeah, absolutely. You don't ever have
Yeah.
to uh, follow that routing off the runway if it's not to where you need to go. And of course, if they need you off the runway for another approach behind you, they'll let you know and you'll get off the.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a very under-taught concept in general aviation as far as how to stay ahead of the airplane. It's really simple. Just have an idea of what could happen later and have that spring loaded in your brain so that when you get to that situation, you're ready for it. It's
Yeah,
it's very easy to stay ahead of the airplane if you know how to plan, know how to be ahead. But that's just part of training, right? And then, of course, like you said, airports, hotspots, NOTAMs, and threats. So Jay, if we could, let's spend a minute or so talking about some specific approach examples. And let's say that you're doing your want briefing, and you're expecting to fly a certain approach procedure. How would that look like? Maybe just give us an example. You can create any scenario you want. You don't have to give us all the details of the scenario, but I'm just going to pull up an approach plate here, and let's say, tell you what, let's look at the RNAV. Let's look at the RNAV Zulu here into 20 right at BNA. This is an approach that I'm sure you've flown at some point. Uh, let's see. How would you say? Okay, we're coming in. We're on the Ryman arrival into Nashville, so we're coming in from the northwest, and
mhm.
you're going to be landing 20 right. You're parking at terminals Charlie. What? How would you run through this as a crew? Maybe just give us an example of a transcript that might have happened.
Yeah. So the first thing is we'll be in cruise, and we're I'm looking to go ahead and brief the arrival and the approach here in a couple minutes. So I'm going to say, to my other pilot, I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to load up the arrival. Now, to be clear, when we loaded the GPS, is what I'll call it in reference to a Part 91 or a small general aviation aircraft or even a general aviation jet. I'll just call it a GPS. So when we've loaded the GPS uh, with the engines off prior to taxiing the airplane, we've already put in an approach and a runway that we expect to land on at our destination. And that could be helpful because if you do go lost comms for any reason, then what you've got loaded in the box was your expected route. And so if you don't have an assigned route and you haven't been vectored for an approach, then your tertiary routing is expected. You don't file typically in our world, you don't file for an approach, you just file for the arrival. So based on the ATIS, when we were building the box for the destination airport, we would go ahead and load an arrival that we filed for an arrival, an approach we expect, and the runway we expect. So we're at cruise, the box is already loaded with an arrival and approach and a runway. I'll say to the other guy, hey, I'm going to go heads down, load the approach. You mind taking the aircraft? And he'll say, I have the aircraft. I'll say, you have the aircraft. It's a positive exchange of flight controls. From that point forward, I'm just going to go through the want brief in my mind and make it up in that scenario. So thinking, okay, I'm in cruise right now. The next thing I'm doing is I'm starting my descent. And so I got to think about, okay, where am I starting my descent? Now, in the jets that I fly, it's pretty well generated for you a top of descent point. So you can run your own calculations if you'd like, but I'll stick with the jet's generated top of descent point based on an idle descent at around 325 knots, or Mach 0.81 or 82 usually. So from that point, I'm going to descend via, or expect to descend via the Ryman RNAV into Nashville. I've got it over here next to me, so if you see me looking to the side, I'm going to verify that my GPS has all of the same altitudes and airspeed restrictions as my updated and current arrival plate shows. So on the Ryman arrival coming from the northwest, let's say we're going to use the Gamma transition. I'll look for at or below flight level 230. I'll continue in Ryman between 19 and 11. Pecky at or above, Pecky at or above 10. Joe Mill at or above 9. Obate 250 knots between 12 and 6. And then at this point, it starts to break off as to which runway you're landing on. So we said we're going to land on 20 right. So over in the notes, I have landing on 20 right from over Obate, track 149 to Y'all, which is at 4,000. Then track 149 to Kular, then track 110 degrees. Expect vectors to the final approach course, cross Y'all at 4,000, Kular 210 knots at 4,000 for landing on 20 right. So I know at the end of this arrival in my GPS, it's going to show me on a track vector for me to maintain until I receive an approach clearance. Then I'm going to look at my approach plate. I'm going to look for the ILS 20 right. The big things for us is we're going to manually input the localizer frequency, the final approach course. I'm going to verify my final approach fix or glide slope intercept altitude at operative 2,000. I'm going to set the appropriate minimums for category 1, 2, or 3, which in this case, we have an operating glide slope, and that would be determined by the NOTAMs as to whether or not the glide slope is in operation. And I set my minimums on my altimeter, bare minimums of 778 feet, which is 200 feet above the field elevation, really above the touchdown zone elevation. I'm looking at when I transition from flying the flight director to outside the aircraft, I'm going to be looking for the PAPI lights to tell me my vertical guidance. So here I'll note that the PAPI lights are on the right side. And then immediately I'll go into what am I thinking about next for a go-around? Oftentimes, go-arounds are assigned by the tower a heading and an altitude. But we need to have prepared to make sure that the GPS is loaded with the published missed approach procedure. So I will look at here, and I see climb to 1,200, climbing right turn to 4,000 on a heading of 300, outbound to the Nashville VOR radial 270 to BV, and hold. I'll make sure that my hold parameters are pre-populated with BV, and that I write down, in the event of a go-around, set 4,000 feet. To me, that's 4K and then either an asterisk or an apostrophe, as well as I'll write down the bottom altitude on the arrival of 4,000 feet at Kular, or if I get a descent via. So I've got 4,000 feet, and then I would just put a little apostrophe next to it to note that it's feet. And when I'm looking at my notes in the aircraft, I know that's going to be my descend via, and I'll write it twice. One's descend via, one's missed approach altitude. I do it the same every time. From there, I'll take a look at the taxi chart. Imagine that I'm landing on 20 right. And okay, I'm going to park in the Charlie concourse. So I know it's going to be a left turn off, probably Bravo 2, taxi up, Bravo, maybe taxi via Kilo, or on runway 31, or cross 31, taxi via Lima. If we make that right turn onto Kilo, there's a hot spot there. If not, then we'll just cross it, right turn on Lima, Tango 4, or Tango 6 into the ramp. From there, there is now a frequency. South ramp is 2995, and north ramp, including the Tangos, the guitar pick is 13137, and north ramp is 2295. So I'll have these frequencies, whichever one based on where I'm parking, pre-selected in my second radio. So we're monitoring guard on 21.5. The backup frequency I'll load is the frequency I intend to park the aircraft with. From there, I'll think, okay, what's my biggest threat? Or having checked the NOTAMs, I will think, what is my biggest threat? Usually, a good threat is if we're descending and below 18,000 feet and we get a runway change, then I don't need to be heads down in the GPS, changing the runway, the approach, and maybe even changing part of the arrival, as you see here on the Ryman, based off of which runway we're landing on. So as part of my brief, I'll include, if we get runway changes below 18, I'll keep the aircraft, you put it in the box, and you brief me on it. And that is a pretty common occurrence in the jet as well. So my briefing for the Ryman arrival, the ILS 20 right approach, the NOTAMs will act like nothing is going, or no NOTAMs actively are affecting our arrival, approach, or landing. And then the biggest threat, which in this case would be a runway change below 18. So I'd say, we're cruising along and say, hey, Toby, I'm going to brief this approach up. You got the aircraft?
I got the aircraft.
All right, you have the aircraft.
I got the aircraft.
Look through everything. I'd start off with, okay, W's for weather. Hey, Toby, information. Alpha is current in Nashville. The winds are 200 at 20 knots. Altimeter is 2992, and they're using the ILS 20 right. There's no RCC codes or anything listed in the ATIS. No other significant weather. Let's call it broken at 1,000 feet. Next, I'm going to look at arrival. So I'm going to address the top of descent and say, yeah, I plan to use the airplane's top of descent point to begin my descent. If not, I'll say, hey, I'm going to start my descent an extra 10 miles early at 1,000 feet per minute. What happened? The Ryman arrival, all the speeds and altitudes check in the box. The bottom altitude is 4,000 feet, 210 knots at Kular. Vectors to the ILS 20 right. The ILS 20 right, localized, it's plate 11-5. It's current as of 10 December 2021. The localized frequency is 111.3. Approach course is 201. Flight step intercept altitude is going to be 2,000 feet at operating. Airport elevation is 600 feet. We set that in our pressurization panel. And bare minimums are 778 feet. We'll get vectors onto the final approach course. I will intercept the localizer, and when we're clear for the approach, I'll arm the glide slope. We intercept to operate at 2,000 feet. Barrow mins again 778 feet. When we break out, the pack is going to be on the right side. We have to go around. It's 1,200 feet right turn 4,000 to BV, and we'll hold at 4,000, otherwise tower assigned. NOTAMs, nothing really applicable to our arrival today. Biggest threat's going to be runway change below 18. You'll build it, plug it, and brief it. I'll keep the aircraft. So the entire first half of the first time you go through the want brief, you're doing it silently, developing what you're going to be saying, what you're going to be briefing, checking the weather, checking the NOTAMs, checking for any big red boxes on the arrival. And then once you have it prepared, you go through it again out loud verbally with the crew member sitting next to you, and you guys develop a shared mental model about how the next 45 minutes of this flight's going to go. I will say I briefed the go right brief. So for landing 20 right, once we break out, again, we've got the minimums. Runway distance 7,704 feet. I'm going to use auto brakes 3, reversers, and I'll kick off to manual brakes about 100 knots. I'll leave the reversers in. I'll expect the captain to take control about 80 knots. If he doesn't take control, I'll get us off on a high speed or make a 90-degree turn. And that's important to brief the two contingencies there. Number one, when the transfer of control is going to happen in an aircraft rolling down the runway. Number two, what happens if the transfer doesn't happen? From that point, the expected taxiways: Bravo, Lima, Tango 4, crossing runway 31, parking at gate Charlie 1. And then that would be included in the airport side of it.
Sure. That makes sense. One thing is important. A lot of the GA guys don't understand is the fact that these jets that you're flying do not have steerable nose wheels on the co-pilot side. You can't. There's no way to use the captain has to taxi. Is what I'm trying to say. They typically have a tiller or something.
We have limited steering of the nose wheel using the rudder, which is effective for rolling down the runway. The rudder becomes really effective somewhere between 30 to 80 or 90 knots, depending on the jet that you're flying. And sometimes with the propeller, if you're flying, a King Air or a PC-12, it could become effective earlier with that prop wash. But yeah, so at some point, rolling down the runway, we're transferring controls of the aircraft during a rejected takeoff and during a normal landing. If the first officer is taking off or landing, during a normal takeoff, the first officer receives control of the aircraft, advances the throttles, and then immediately hands the throttle control back to the captain in the case of a rejected takeoff. In the case of landing, the first officer manipulates all the controls until they're approaching normal taxi speed, which is usually about 30 knots. And at that point, the captain should have controls of the aircraft. So somewhere between 100 knots and 30 knots, we transfer controls of the aircraft again. I can turn the airplane out. The smaller jet on the 175, I can taxi it with the nose wheel because of the difference in the wheelbase, the shorter wheelbase of that jet. The larger and longer jets, you would have to use differential braking. The nose wheel steering is only good for a couple degrees side to side. You don't have the full authority of the tiller. Some jets do come with a tiller on both the captain and the first officer's side, but any jet or every jet that I've flown has not had that option installed. Instead, I have a additional sort of cubby or cup holder over there for me that the captain needs to be jealous about.
Well, man, first world problems. All right. Well, hey, I really appreciate you coming on and talking with us about this stuff today. It's been a good idea to get an idea of the inside of what an airline pilot deals with when it comes to briefing departures and briefing arrivals. We'll definitely put some of the notes of this episode in the IFR Pilot Mastermind in the resources section, so you guys can be able to check that out. No problem. And if you haven't already, you're listening to this podcast right now, if you haven't already and you haven't become a member of the exclusive IFR Pilot Mastermind community, check that out. The link is going to be in the description or on Instagram. DM me the word mastermind, and it will send you a link to the application screening page. It's an exclusive community of instrument pilots, instructors, examiners, and air traffic controllers who all share the same vision of keeping a lifetime proficiency in currency for instrument pilots, real world tricks and training for real world pilots, not just passing the check, right? Actually getting good and staying good. And Jay, I'm gonna send you an email and give you an invite to that, and you can be one of the guys helping out. So if you're interested in participating, you're more than welcome to,
Thank
as
you.
a professional. Um, in the meantime, we'll definitely have you back on the podcast here soon. This is a recorded section of the podcast, so here in a moment we'll switch over to the live portion where we'll do your Q&A, and we'll go from there. So, Jay, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today, and we'll definitely have you back real soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, perfect. And moving on to the Q&A, we'll transition over to that right now. So I am joined here today by my friend and colleague, Matt Lundquist, who is now joining on the stream with me today. All right, looks like we're doing good. Thank you guys for joining back on the stream. I've got some Q&A that we're going to answer together, Matt and I, and we're going to go ahead and do that now. So sorry for the technical difficulties. Looking forward to getting into that now. Matt, go ahead and let us know. Tell us about yourself. What's going on in your side of the industry, and give us a little feedback on yourself while I pull these questions up.
Cool. So I'm Matt Lundquist, go by Lundy. As you can see, Powerlift CF double I. So one of, I think, 65 only. Yep, 65 only in the FAA. So I'm a military Osprey pilot. I have 9 deployments, 2,500 hours in that aircraft, and pushing 2,700 total hours. So I've done fixed wing helicopters and powered lift, and my poor pilot license, every time that DPE has to update it, it just looks like word vomit on the back. I think I have a little bit of everything. So I'm excited to be here. Yeah.
That's pretty incredible. Yeah, Powerlift CFI. That's going to be like your CV-22 Ospreys, your eVTOLs. Think like drones that hold people is kind of the idea, at least in the civilian world. What's the name of that one that I think Westland makes? Which is the one that's the civilian version?
So Augusta Westmoreland was bought out by a company called Leonardo, and it's the Leonardo 609. That's the closest to a civilian Osprey that you can have. And then Joby has a current electric one. Both of those are a thing called a tilt rotor, which means that the rotor head actually tilts forward for forward flight. A physical transformer.
Okay, I see. Interesting. Well, that's very interesting. Appreciate you coming on and helping us out today. We're going to have you probably on here a little more often, and we'll go from there. But in the meantime, the first question that I've got here on the live stream is a question from Aviator Vikram, who I've been speaking with. He's a member of our Instrument Pilot Mastermind. I'll put a link to that here in the description. So if you're not already a member of the Instrument Pilot Mastermind, you can DM me the word mastermind and I'll send you the link to join. It is an exclusive member of lifetime instrument pilots and instructors and examiners. We've got, of course, airplane, helicopter, powered lift. We've got a whole assortment of instructors and pilots all dedicated to helping each other grow together in the industry as instrument professionals. So that's what you guys can do. Join the Instrument Pilot Mastermind, become a monthly member, and make it happen. So in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and get right into the question. So this question that we have right now is currency requirements. You can see if you're watching this on the live stream, you see the currency requirements. We're going to talk about 6-hit, and you guys should be familiar with that from your instrument training. So the question from Vikram says that he passed his oral exam, but the flight portion didn't happen because of weather. That kind of stuff happens. I'm sorry about that. That's really unfortunate. But on the oral exam, there's a question about the currency. And he passed that. And that was no problem. But he had some questions about it. So we're going to talk about that now. Basically, what are the currency requirements for instrument flying? And how do you stay current as an instrument pilot? So I'll go ahead and talk about that here from the civilian side. But Matt, I asked you a question about that. So there may be some differences in the military when you're doing that, but we're not worried about that. We're about the civilian side. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but basically, when it comes to staying current as an instrument pilot, it's not the same as proficiency, right? You need to go out there
Correct.
and get proficient and fly more often. But as far as I am aware in my several thousand hours of giving instrument instruction, uh, in order to stay current as an instrument pilot, you must have in the past 6 months flown 6 instrument approaches, which need to be, either in actual or simulated instrument conditions with a safety pilot or something. And in that 6 month period, you must have done at least 6 instrument approaches and a hold, and have intercepted and tracked navigational signals and radials. If you have done that in the past 6 months, then you are current for IFR flight. Now, let's say you go past that 6 month window, and in the past 6 months, you've only flown 4 instrument approaches, and maybe you didn't do a hold, right? Well, you're not current anymore. So what do you do to get current, right? And the answer is very simple. You can either go out with a safety pilot, and that safety pilot will look outside and watch for traffic while you are, on the foggles on your instrument view limiting devices, and you go out and you'll shoot those approaches and do the hold, and you'll be able to stay current. You can also do it with an instrument instructor, or you can have an IPC, or even pass an instrument check ride. So, for example, if you are an instrument rated pilot as a commercial pilot and you go past an ATP check ride is an instrument check ride. So you would count for your instrument currency there. Now, there's a grace period that we talk about a lot, Matt. And tell us, what do you know about that grace period? Because I know that we have our 6 months, and then that we have to stay current within. And then there's a 6 month period after that. And then there's another period after that. Can you break that down for us?
So, to be quite honest, I'd have to go back and review it
Okay.
for that. But I think the framework of this conversation, and just for the young aviators out there, is this: the true difference between currency and proficiency is this flying line. Currency, to be current, is to be legal. That is legal, and those regulations are unfortunately in aviation written in blood. So for that reason, when we talk currencies, and I'm instructing and providing instruction, these things are safety of flight things that were manifested out of rules and regulations for safety of flight. Proficiency is some of our own internal stuff, like our capability and skills to say that yes, we can go out and safely execute the mission. But the biggest thing to understand with currencies is the legality of it. You never have to commit, for young aviators, you never have to commit things to memory. Yes, you're going to get asked by your DPE, but this is a perfect time that I would go grab my FAR aim and we would crack it out and look at it together, because these have to be legally derived.
Sure, absolutely. I while you were talking, I pulled up the actual regulations for this. And basically, it's in Part 61, tells you all about what your currency requirements are. It's going to be 6157 in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 14. And it talks all about the procedures and requirements for staying current instruments. So basically, in the past 6 month period, you have to have 6 approaches done and a hold, and you have had to intercept and track radials. If you do those things within that period, you're current. Now, let's say in the past 6 months, you've only had 4 approaches. Well, you're not current. So you can either go out with a safety pilot or an instructor and in the airplane and go get those, or in the helicopter, or whatever, or a powered lift, whatever. And you can go get that currency done. Alternatively, you can actually use a flight simulator. If you have an FAA approved BATD or AATD or, level D simulator, or there's a variety of levels, right? But if you have an approved aviation training device or flight simulator that is approved by the FAA for locking currency, then you can go complete those approaches in there. And you can actually do that without a safety pilot or without an instructor. Now, that time frame when you're allowed to do that is 6 months long. So there's the first 6 months, which is your currency for, in the past 6 months, you got to have the 6 approaches. After that 6 months is over, then it's another 6 months where you're allowed to go out with a safety pilot or use a flight sim. But after that 6 months, if you're still not current, basically, if you're not current, for, let's see here. If
That'd
the
be 12
last time
months.
you were basically 12 months, if you have not been current for, I would say if you're not current for 6 months, is technically the correct term. If you are not current for 6 months, that's 6 plus 6 is 12. Then you have to go up with a flight instructor and do either an IPC or an IPC. It's basically what you have to do. You have one option. You can take an IPC or take an instrument check ride, and that can be with an instructor, it can be with a pilot examiner, FAA inspector, or whatever. So I hope that answers your question. That's basically what's going on. 6157 is the regulation. The regulation reads pretty plain and simple, but people do get confused on it pretty often. So there's that. Looking at the comment section here on the Instagram Live, let's see here. I see a comment says, I grabbed the FAR aim and there was no grace period that I had been taught. He asked the instructor to come in, told the grace period simply doesn't exist, and that was true in the FAR aim. So we're gonna look at this and find this right now just to verify this. 6157. Give me one moment to pull this up. There may be some confusion as to what's legally taught here. Give me one moment. So let's see, FAR 6157. We're gonna pull that up on Google and pull this up. The topic today is recency experience, recent flight experience for pilot in command. Let's look up instruments. So I'm going to read this out right here. It says that, okay. Instrument experience, part C says, except as provided in paragraph E, which doesn't apply to us here, a person may act as pilot in command under IFR or weather conditions less than the minimums prescribed for a VFR, only if, then it says, airplane powered lift, so on. We're talking airplanes right now, so we're going to use that one. Only if, 1, within 6 calendar months preceding the month of the flight, that person performed and logged at least the following tasks and iterations in an airplane, etc., for their currency. I'm paraphrasing. It says you have to have 6 approaches, 6 holding procedures, 6 approaches, holding procedures and tasks, and intercepting and tracking courses through the use of navigational electronic systems. So in the past 6 months, you have to have that done. If you have not done that, well, what do you do, right? So we're going to keep reading the regulation and seeing exactly what it says. So it says here under section D, it says, except as provided in paragraph echo, which I'm going to find echo and see what that reads out here. It says, except as provided in paragraph E of this section, a person who has failed to meet the experience requirements of C, which we just read, for more than 6 calendar months. That's the grace period right there. Okay, we found it. Okay, for more than 6 calendar months. Isn't that right, Lundy? Is what we literally just said, is that if you are not current for 6 months, then you have to do an IPC, is what it says here. So that's the answer to your question, is that 6157 D1 says the IPC is required if you have failed to meet the experience requirements for currency for more than 6 calendar months. And then, of course, in the IPC, you have to talk about air traffic control procedures, a reference to instrument, navigation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it has to be done in an aircraft or a full flight simulator, and so on. And it has to be done by an authorized instructor or an examiner or something like that. And the exceptions in paragraph echo says things about operating under part 119, 125, and turbine powered this and that and whatever. And that's not really applicable to us right now, just flying around in flight training like we're talking about today. So does that answer your question? Does that make sense, guys? Drop in the comments. Let me know if that makes sense. That's basically what it is if you are not current for 6 months, then you have to have an IPC. It's that time of you not being current to, let's say this, you were good for 6 months. I go out today. Let's say this. Today is March 9th, 2024. If I go out and I fly 6 approaches, do a hold and a intercepting and tracking of a radial today, and then I do all that today, in 6 months, I will no longer be current. I'm current today, but at 6 months and 1 day or whatever, as soon as the 7th calendar month occurs, I will not be current. from that month for another 6 months, I have time to get current by flying with the safety pilot or an instructor to get my approaches back. And if I don't do it in that time frame, then the ruling in 6157D comes in, where it says someone who has been out of currency for 6 months or more has to do an IPC. So I think that breaks it down pretty well. What do you think, Matt?
So this does bring up a point about being professional aviators. This threshold is actually very low. To do 6 in 6 months equates to simple math, 1 a month. If you are flying more than once a month and you are not logging an instrument approach on one of your flights, that gets into our discussions of proficiency.
Yes.
Just because currency-wise, you can log all 6 January 1st and never do them again until you need to like re-up your 6-month currency. That does not make a proficient or professional pilot. When we talk about things like this, consistency is the key. As an individual that in the military, we have to log in my aircraft on a daily sortie. We have about 150 items that we have to log annually to keep current on. If I can do an instrument approach at the end of a 5.0 doing tactical combat stuff, then you and your Cessna can do an approach coming home as an IFR pilot. Because ideally, you want to get paid to do this flying thing. That's called being a professional. Being a professional is the habits you do right now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's very important to define the difference between I can't talk today. I'm so sorry. Proficiency and currency. It's very important. There's a question listed here in the chat, and this is going to be probably the last question that we're going to answer for right now, and then we're going to close out the podcast and see you guys next week. That question is this. Flying IFR, ATC asks you if you have the field in sight. You answer yes. It says you answer yes. Then it says, in case of go around, should you follow published missed approach or do a visual circuit? What do you think about that?
Have you canceled IFR?
You're flying IFR.
If I'm still on IFR flight rules, I'm going to follow my IFR flight rules. Their delineation of in sight, largely when I've had it, is to delineate, switch to tower, or to help with traffic flow, traffic management. But this goes back to being a professional pilot. Use common sense to put the aircraft in the safest manner and follow the regulations for the structure you're under. If you're IFR, stay IFR. If you want to proceed visually and just do a traffic pattern, be clear with your intentions. It is okay sometimes to over communicate when it comes to clarity if it improves safety.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing about this is, from an air traffic control standpoint, I have some experience in that regard. Is if you say, hey, I have the field in sight, I'm only going to care about that as an air traffic controller, right? Or as in that regard. I'm not an FAA certificated air traffic controller, but I'm saying from a standpoint of having been gone through certain trainings relating to that. As an air traffic controller, hypothetically, I don't care about you having the field in sight unless I'm expecting to give you a visual approach, in which case you're no longer on an instrument procedure. You're on an instrument flight plan, right? You're still an instrument flight. But if you have to do a go around and it's a visual conditions and you're on a visual approach, there is no go around procedure outside of you going around and doing what you got to do, right? And think about it. It's all going to be very simple. If you go around on a visual approach, tower is going to tell you what to do, right? And if you go around on a visual approach at an untowered airport on an instrument flight plan you haven't canceled yet, what are you going to do? You're going to join the pattern around and land. You're still on a visual approach, right? The difference being, what do we do if we lose comms? I think that's the real root of the question, is what is the lost comms procedure? Because everything that we do in instrument flying is based on our lost comms procedure. What do we do? In which case, what is a lost comms procedure for you lose comms in VMC? It's fly VFR, right? Like squawk 1200 and land or something like that, right? So that's what I would do. I would just come back around, look for light gun signals, and I would land. So I think that answers your question there. Gringo V8 is the username here on the chat. So yeah, if you have the field in sight and you're on a visual approach, then, do what ATC tells you. And if they don't tell you to do anything specific on a missed approach, then, your visual conditions. So circle back around, look for light gun signals and land. So I hope that answers you guys' questions today, and really looking forward to next week on the podcast. We got a lot of really cool stuff coming out. We're gonna do some live Q&A. If you are not already a member of the IFR Pilot Mastermind community, you are missing out on something. We've got tons of live Q&A, real questions being answered. Real questions receiving real answers, and real world flying, IFR, all that kind of stuff. We got instructors in there, DPEs, we got air traffic controllers, everybody. So if you want to stay proficient, as Lundy said, in staying IFR, and from an instructor standpoint and as a pilot standpoint, then this is the community for you. It's an exclusive community. We're currently accepting members. Link in bio or the description below if you're on YouTube, or if you are listening to this podcast right now, when you have time, go on over to Toby Rice CFI on Instagram, and the link is in my bio. You can alternatively DM me the word mastermind, or comment to this post the word mastermind, and I will send you the application form to fill out. We can get you in. So until next time, it's good to have you guys on here. Matt, I appreciate you coming on the show today and just giving a little bit of insight. I wish we would have had more time, but we had the previous interview we had to take care of. But we'll definitely get you on next time and talk about some of your war stories. So I appreciate you coming on.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
All right. Wonderful. All right. Until next time, guys, we will see you on the Instrument Pilot Podcast. Catch you next week.